Good morning, everybody. I'm here with Stan Cho, the MPP for Willowdale, and my parliamentary assistant, to present the 2020-21 first quarter finances. When I was appointed Minister of Finance, I committed to provide an update to the people of Ontario on their public finances each quarter. And especially during a global pandemic, it's important that we keep our promises. That is why Ontario, unique among governments in Canada, presented a one-year economic and fiscal update on March 25th, just days after the province had entered a state of emergency and weeks after the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. In introducing Ontario's action plan responding to COVID-19, our government had three goals. First, to provide immediate resources and relief for healthcare, families, workers, and businesses. Second, to create a fiscal plan that was flexible, that would allow us to react quickly to an unprecedented crisis unfolding at an unprecedented pace, and that worked in partnership with federal and municipal governments. And third, to provide the people of Ontario an honest assessment of their public finances based on the best numbers available at the time. The plan included $3.3 billion in additional resources for healthcare, $3.7 billion to support people, jobs, and measures to provide relief to seniors, parents, students, and workers, and $10 billion made available to improve cash flows for people and businesses through tax and other deferrals. Taken together, these first steps outlined in Ontario's action plan responding to COVID-19 made available $17 billion to support the health of people and businesses in Ontario. Since we announced that initial $17 billion response, a lot has changed, and it's time today for another update. Today, I can report that under Premier Ford's leadership, our government is making available $30 billion in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This includes $7.7 billion to provide ongoing support for healthcare to build hospital capacity, prevent and contain the spread of COVID-19 in long-term care homes, ramp up testing, purchase personal protective equipment, and ensure vulnerable people continue to have access to prescription medication. It also includes $11 billion to support people and jobs by providing a temporary pay increase to more than 375,000 eligible frontline workers, funding to help municipal partners and transit agencies deliver critical services, and relief for residential, farm, industrial, and commercial electricity consumers. Responsible stewardship of the taxpayers' dollars is in our government's DNA. Given the unprecedented and unpredictable nature of events back in March, we felt allocating a high level of contingency and reserve was necessary. And so the plan we released on March 25th included historic levels of prudence, including a dedicated $1 billion COVID-19 health contingency fund, and a standard contingency fund of $1.3 billion, and an unprecedented reserve of $2.5 billion, the largest in Ontario's history. From an economic and a health perspective, we remain in uncertain times. The risk of a second wave is real, despite our collective efforts to avert it. The economic impacts of COVID-19 globally and in Ontario are still unfolding. As we all slowly and steadily and safely reopen, our promise remains to do whatever is necessary to respond to COVID-19. For these reasons, the update we are announcing today once again contains historic levels of prudence. In total, our government has committed an additional $9.6 billion to maintain our flexible, responsive approach to the global pandemic. That includes a $4.3 billion increase in our COVID-19 health contingency fund to protect our seniors in long-term care, prevent a resurgence of cases, and respond with overwhelming medical resources if we do experience a second wave. Even as case numbers decline, we know that people and businesses are still struggling as a result of this health crisis. So our plan also includes a $3 billion top-up to our Support for People and Jobs Fund. So just as we had the flexibility to put our resources where they could make the biggest difference and impact at the height of the outbreak, we will maintain our ability to support people and employers as they safely reopen and we enter the recovery stage. We have also set aside $2.2 billion for our standard contingency, well above the normal amount in acknowledgement of these unpredictable times. Today, I'm also announcing we have extended our provincial tax deferrals until October 1st, 2020. With this announcement, which aligns with our federal partners, we will provide people and businesses a total of up to $11.3 billion in cash flow support. In extending provincial tax deferrals, we're allowing businesses to keep more of their money when they need it the most, helping them to get through this difficult period and successfully reopen their doors to employees and to customers. One of the most important reasons we provide these regular updates is to be transparent about the economic assumptions underlying our financial plans. The most current private sector forecasts, on average, project that Ontario real GDP will decline by 6.6% in 2020, down significantly from the estimates in our March 25th economic and fiscal update. We knew it would be difficult to make accurate predictions given the unprecedented situation, which is one of the reasons these updates are so important. Today, we are revising our revenue projections from $156.3 billion to $150.6 billion, a significant factor in our projected deficit rising to $38.5 billion. While the current level of government spending and deficits are not sustainable over the long run, they are necessary today. Necessary to respond to the health crisis. Necessary to get people back to work. Necessary to provide families relief, and necessarily to safely reopen our economy. As Premier Ford often reminds us, 14.5 million people across Ontario have done what is necessary to defeat COVID-19. People have stayed home and taken precautions to stop the spread. Employers temporarily closed to protect customers and staff. Ontario manufacturers pivoted to produce essential supplies. And frontline healthcare workers have served around the clock to protect us. Back on March 25th, I said, there are moments that define a generation, and COVID-19 is our moment. I think it's clear that the people of our province have risen to the challenge. The reality of COVID-19 is not a choice for any of us, but choosing how we respond is. From the very beginning, our government chose to do whatever was necessary to protect the people of Ontario from this virus and support them as they deal with the unprecedented impacts this has had on their lives. But much more importantly, the people of Ontario have chosen to respond by demonstrating patience, kindness, responsibility, and respect. More than anything else, that has made the difference. From the outset, Premier Ford and our government have been clear that putting public health first not only would save lives, but was the smartest economic policy. The faster and steadier our progress to contain the outbreak, the sooner restrictions can be lifted, so employees can get back to work and students can get back to school. Like the rest of the global economy, Ontario faces a long road to economic recovery. While every recession is different, it is worth noting it took between 28 and 88 months to return to pre-recession employment in the past 3 downturns. However, as Ontario gradually reopens, following the plan outlined in a framework to reopen our province, there have been recent signs of cautious optimism. In June and July, Ontario's employment increased by 528,600 jobs, and the unemployment rate decreased to 11.3%. Home resales in the province rose 56% in May and 67% in June, and retail sales rose 14% in May, following 2 consecutive monthly decreases in March and April. While we still have a long road to recovery, defeating the virus is essential to getting our economy growing again and to ensure the long-term sustainability of public finances. That's why we continue to take a prudent and responsible approach to managing the pandemic, which is also reflected in the approach to the province's finances. Every step of the way, our actions will continue to be informed by input from our partners, including science and health professionals, business and labor leaders, nonprofit, faith and community organizations, and people from every region of our province. Since March, the Ontario Jobs and Recovery Committee has established 56 ministerial advisory councils. The government has benefited from input received in over 1,000 online submissions and more than 240 virtual consultations. Informed by the feedback we've received from across Ontario, today's update represents the thoughtful and deliberate approach we have taken to protect the health and safety of the people of our province. We will continue to take a responsible approach that allows us to continue assessing the economic situation and put forward a long-term outlook based on the most recent and reliable data available. Our government will provide the next fiscal update, a multi-year provincial budget, no later than November 15th of 2020. Until then, all of us must continue to do what is necessary to defeat COVID-19. Thank you, and I'll be pleased to take your questions.
Okay, so we'll now go to the phone line for questions. We're going to do one question and one follow-up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the question and answer session. Should you have a question, please press star followed by 1 on your touch-tone phone. You will hear a 3-tone prompt acknowledging your request, and your questions will be polled in the order they are received. If you are using a speakerphone, please lift the handset before pressing any keys. Your first question comes from Sean Jeffords, Canadian Press. Sean, please go ahead.
Good morning, Minister.
Morning, Sean.
I wanted to ask you about the government's budget projections going into even the next quarter. Given that we've seen these projections dramatically rise today, are you expecting that over the next 6 months, frankly, we could see a further doubling of the province's deficit?
Sean, we've set aside contingencies so that we believe we have the resources available to support what Ontarians need, whether it's from a health or a community or a jobs perspective. Obviously, we are in unprecedented times in terms of volatility. I'm very encouraged. Another day today, I know, where we've had less than 100 cases in Ontario. So I'm very encouraged by the progress that we're making in terms of the both the economy and the health situation. But as we've said from the outset, we will do what is necessary. We want to provide these updates regularly. The next one will come in November. And we believe we've set aside the resources required so that we can support healthcare, support communities, support jobs, and get the economy back on its feet.
And Minister, I know that the government prior to the pandemic had promised to balance the budget into what would be a potential second year of another mandate. What does that do to the government's, or what does this do, what does the pandemic do to the government's aspirations to balance the province's books?
Well, as I said, the idea of being responsible with taxpayers' dollars is in our DNA, and you're quite right. We were on track to balancing the province's budget. We had to make a swift about-face back in March and projected the large deficit that we did then, and obviously today we're talking about a $38.5 billion deficit. Right now, the priority needs to be to provide the resources that are required. We know that governments shouldn't and can't spend at these kind of levels in the long term. It's simply not sustainable, and it's not responsible to the future generations that need to pay for those debts. But right now, the most important thing we can do is make the resources available, make sure that we're protecting the health of Ontarians, that our health system has that ability to respond with overwhelming capacity as we potentially face a second wave, and that we support jobs in the economy and, of course, continue to work with the federal and municipal governments in that regard. So, I think that we will get to the conversation again about a return to balance. But right now, it's important that we focus on this problem in front of us. We've made some great strides thanks to 14.5 million Ontarians, but there's still work to do.
Thank you. Your next question comes from Laura Stone, Globe and Mail. Laura, please go ahead.
Hi, Minister.
Good morning, Laura.
The document points to an employment decline that is significantly larger than the declines recorded in past recessions. Does this mean that we're headed for an inevitable recession here in Ontario?
Yeah, we are in a recession today in Ontario, and I would argue across Canada. The challenge in terms of return to employment levels that were previously held, which, as you all recall, were record employment for several generations. Unemployment was at a rate of 5.5% in Ontario last calendar year. The largest number of jobs ever created in the province of Ontario, 200,000, were created just last year. But obviously that circumstance has changed. The reason it's important to point out that each recession is different. In previous recessions, we've seen 28 months to return to that employment level, previous employment level, or from the early 90s, for those of us who remember that far back, it took 88 months to return to previous employment levels. So this is all going to be a factor that's affected by many things, most importantly, the health situation. So underlying this economic crisis is the health crisis. And so that's why the work that Ontarians have been doing, that's why the work that our public health officials have been doing, that's why the investments, frankly, this government has been making in healthcare and in supporting the fight with COVID-19 are vital to the economic recovery. But of course, we're also going to have to address issues of what's happening with our major trading partners to the south in the United States, where we all know they're having challenges from a health perspective, and other impacts on the economy. So we are in for a difficult economic time. We've always been very frank with Ontarians about that. That's why it's so important that we're transparent, and frankly, it's why it's so important that Ontarians came together to battle COVID-19 and that we keep doing the right things, follow the public health advice. That's the best thing we can do to help the economy.
Thank you. Your next question.
Sorry. Minister, I think many, or at least some of your supporters and voters will look at this deficit figure today and say, I didn't vote for this. This is not what I expected when I elected this government. What do you say to people who wonder what went wrong here and if your government could have reopened the economy sooner to prevent this extremely high deficit number you're announcing today?
So what I say, because people ask, I think most people, Laura, as I've traveled around the province, understand and appreciate this is why governments, have financial capacity. It's to spend at times like this. But there are two words for it: a global pandemic. This is an unprecedented health crisis internationally. I think the progress that Ontario's making is emblematic of a plan that we laid out in April that is working. Again, less than 100 cases today. And this doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels. There is still risk in COVID-19. But I believe that the investments we've made and the approach we've taken, which is deliberate, we always said we are going to be steady and we're going to be careful when it comes to health of Ontarians, but that's also the best approach for the economy. And that, when you start to look around the world, many other jurisdictions, I think that is proving to be the right approach. But it only works if the 14.5 million Ontarians, including the business people who had to close their businesses and now reopen them, all the employees, all the health co-workers, it only works if we all work together, and that's what we need to continue to do.
Thank you. Your next question comes from Ashley Legasic, News Talk 1010. Ashley, please go ahead.
Good morning, Minister. My first question is regarding a look ahead to the future, which I know is not easy to do right now. But at this point, are you able to comment on, barring a second wave, what the economic outlook could look like for next year? Could it be worse than what we're seeing now?
So actually, it's a great question. Right now, and we take this advice from the leading private sector economists and then our own work that we do, we expect a rebound in the neighborhood of 5%, advance of 5% in terms of next year. But of course, you pointed out that all depends on a number of features that we don't fully understand yet. We've made sure that we have the resources, that $4.3 billion of additional health care money available in the emergency COVID health contingency so that we can respond to a second wave. We know two things from openings around the world and from our own experience now, but there have been two things that happened globally when economies reopened. The first was that there are always flare-ups. We know that that's going to happen. And people's confidence is built by the ability to handle those issues. And our public health professionals have done a fabulous job. You'll all remember the nail bar in Kingston and the issue there, and they were able to contain and control that. So flare-ups happen. They've happened around the world, and our ability to contain and control them is vital. The second thing that happens everywhere is that fewer people come back than is expected, whether that's to business, to school, to places of worship. People are hesitant, not surprisingly. So the confidence that they build through our steady but very planful approach is the kind of thing that will bring more people back into the economy. That will mean that we're more likely to have a better year next year. But as you point out, there's volatility in terms of a second wave. There's certainly volatility in terms of what's going on in the United States right now and the impacts that has on the Canadian economy. And so those are all things that we'll continue to monitor and measure, and that's why we put so much prudence into today's plan.
Thanks, Minister. And my next question, just going off of what you were just saying about a second wave itself, I just want to dive a bit deeper into some things you did mention in your comments. How exactly is the government preparing from an economic standpoint for that potential second wave, and how badly would our economy be impacted if we saw similar lockdown measures to what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic?
Yeah, it is a question that we ask ourselves every day and work on it every day, and we work with the smartest minds, whether it's from business or from the medical profession or science on. We've learned something in terms of what we did last time, and obviously that plan is working. The case numbers show it. Ideally, in a circumstance going forward, we wouldn't need to see the same broad-scale lockdown that we saw previously, although we have said we'll do what's necessary if that's required. But we've learned a lot. Businesses have learned a lot in the work that we've been doing in terms of preparing and working with businesses, preparing and work with our health professionals, things like contact tracing, which we've invested significantly in, things like our new app, which again, significant investments with the federal government to make it easier for us to, as I said, when we have those flare-ups, shut down in a one locality as necessary, but not have to do a broader shutdown. But most important is what those 14.5 million Ontarians that have led the way so far, what they keep doing. It's in all of our hands to make sure that we maintain the physical distances, that we wash our hands, that we wear masks as we should, and that we're careful. And if we are, then my hope is that we won't have to see another broad-scale lockdown, because as we're seeing right now in the United States, that has very, very significant negative economic impacts, and that hurts communities, jobs, and people.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, should you have a question, please press star 1 on your touch-tone phone. Your next question comes from Colin DeMello, CTV News. Colin, please go ahead.
Hi, Minister. Good morning. I'm wondering about tax deferrals. I'm just wondering if there is a tax forgiveness program on the horizon at all, because businesses are obviously struggling with the lack of revenue, and now, revenue is not really flowing in because people are still, getting back online with their work. Is there any kind of tax forgiveness program on the horizon?
We've had discussions, Colin, with a wide range of businesses and others about many options. Of course, the tax deferrals are not simply at the provincial level. I mentioned $11.3 billion. That's principally tax deferrals. There's also a municipal property tax deferrals, very widely accepted. We enabled $1.8 billion worth of deferrals from a property tax perspective. Of course, the federal federal government has done a number of tax deferrals as well. So we will, we'll continue to discuss what the best options are. We want to support business. We know that it's very challenging out there, particularly for our smaller businesses, and we want to make sure they have the support that they need. But for the time being, a deferral, that's $1.3 billion of additional support in terms of cash flow. That's what I've heard a lot of businesses asking for. They appreciate the fact that an extension like this gives them some additional time as they get reopened. And I think we're all starting to see, businesses reopen and economic activities safely and slowly come back.
Okay, thank you. And as a follow-up, people might be surprised to learn that the government only spent $218 million during the pandemic on long-term care. I'm curious as to why the government didn't, really open up the bank account to spend more money. And was $218 million enough to place an iron ring around the sector?
Well, that's part of the $243 million that we committed to in March, and you're right, most of that money was spent. Of course, in addition to that, we've seen a commitment of $1.75 billion, a new funding program to build new beds. The Premier and Minister Fullerton have announced close to 1,500 new beds that will be built in months, not years, in 3 different locations over the last number of weeks. And of course, we've also had extensive discussions about what we need to do from a human resource and staffing perspective. So, the Premier has made it clear. The problem in our long-term care, the tragedy in our long-term care system, built up over many governments, over many years of many parties. But he and our government have committed to solve it. We will. Part of that as well, of course, is with a full public vetting of it and a public review and inquiry. And all of those component parts together are going to make sure that what happened before doesn't happen again.
Thank you. Your next question comes from Cynthia Mulligan, City TV. Cynthia, please go ahead.
Hi, Minister.
Hello, Cynthia.
As you noted, your government was on track to balance the books in like 2-3 years from now, and now you're staring at a $38.5 billion deficit, and as one, is that keeping you up at night? But two, once COVID is behind us, how on earth are you going to tackle that deficit, and how ugly is it going to be in terms of cuts for taxpayers?
In terms of sleeping, the Premier's got us all working so hard. We don't have any trouble when our head hits the pillow. I think everybody falls asleep pretty quick. But future debt and deficits are absolutely a very important topic. One of the reasons I got into government was to make sure that the finances of our province were well managed, that they reflected respect for taxpayers' dollars. So that was a priority for us before. It remains a priority. As I said, respect for taxpayers is in our DNA. But right now, Cynthia, and I hear this over and over again as I travel, I'm sure you hear it as well. People, understand that we need to support each other right now. They understand that the role of government, federal, provincial, municipal, is critical right now. So yes, there are going to be challenges on the other side of this. But the best thing we can do for the economy, and that means the best thing we can do for the long-term financial health here in Ontario, is make sure that we tackle and defeat COVID-19. We're not done with that yet. We're going to keep making those investments, but it's not just because it's going to save lives. Of course, that's of primary importance, but it's also because that's the best route to economic recovery.
In my follow-up, Minister, are you already, though, looking ahead at how you're going to tackle this budget down the road?
We do. Of course, in November, we'll have a budget. As you would all know, a budget will then have a multi-year perspective. So we'll be able to start to look out beyond just this fiscal year. I should point out as well that, again, Ontario, as we were the first on March 25th to present a COVID plan and to present financials, and we are again updating them before other governments do. In November, we'll be the first to provide that multi-year outlook, and we'll have more clarity then. There's so many variables right now in terms of economic recovery, and as we've seen from the reduction in revenues, that growth in the economy, the effect on our businesses, the effect on individuals has a dramatic effect on the fiscal situation of the province. So we'll have a better view of that in November, and we will make sure that we update Ontarians as we do every quarter.
Thank you. Your next question comes from Antonella Artuso, Toronto Sun. Antonella, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, Minister. I wanted to ask you if you are anticipating a profound, significant long-term change to the economy as a result of the pandemic. We're already hearing about restaurant businesses that don't expect to continue, changes in working from home, that sort of thing.
Antonella, that's also one of the questions that I get asked, and frankly, I ask others, some of the leading economic and business experts. And I think, this is a case where we don't fully know what the impacts are going to be. I can tell you, on the weekend, I was in my riding in Ajax and visiting restaurants, and I think, we're seeing a slow but steady recovery, but quite clearly, this recession is going to be very difficult on the hospitality industry, very difficult on the tourism industry, for obvious reasons, because of the change in behavior. And I think we are all going to have to wait and see how that behavior changes and how business models change. When it comes to things like the travel industry, obviously significant impact that is coming out of this. And as you mentioned, behavior changes. So I think this is going to have a lasting impact. Whether that lasting impact is good or bad for specific businesses is going to depend a lot on what we see in terms of how consumer behavior evolves and changes. But as I said, the most important thing we can do is keep focusing on the health crisis. As the COVID-19 virus recedes, the economy will come back up. And we've seen elsewhere, particularly in the United States, where they have further outbreaks, shutdowns go on, that can be devastating, particularly for small businesses, and none of us want to see that.
Thank you. Your next question comes from Sabrina Nanji, Queen's Park Today.
Contingency fund has been spent so far.
Sorry, Sabrina, could you ask again? I didn't hear the first part of your question.
Oh, sorry, yeah. So the contingency fund, how much of it has been spent so far?
Well, there were a number of contingency funds. That's why we've topped them up again. So the $1 billion in terms of, for instance, you'll see that the government spent $610 million on PPE. So you can see that some of the areas specifically where expenditures on the COVID contingency fund had to spend. We've also topped up the general contingency fund, and then we're adding again to the People and Jobs Fund. So the reason we're putting new money into those funds is because we see that there's a need for future support going out, for the remainder of this fiscal year, which, as you know, goes to the end of March. And these are our projections about the costs of that additional support and obviously where we think we'll end up from a revenue and from a expense perspective.
Okay, thank you. And I'm also hoping to needle you a bit on the tax deferrals, Minister. The FAO had said that they're valued less because of income and revenue declines, and you seem to have taken that into account for the province's revenues. But in terms of their worth, how do you reconcile the difference between what the FAO is saying and I believe the $11 billion you mentioned today?
No, and listen, we always appreciate the work of the FAO. It's very helpful. We get very real-time updates, as you'd expect at the Ministry of Finance when it relates to tax. But of course, the nature of a deferral is we won't actually know fully the take-up of those deferrals. I know from talking to many businesses and individuals, they very much appreciated the additional cash flow and have taken advantage of them. We won't know until the end of the period when we actually then are able to calculate it, what the exact impact of those deferrals are. So obviously we're hopeful. The federal government has also, I have to give them credit, provided significant deferral capacity. And I know that many businesses, particularly in those harder hit sectors, I mentioned some of them, have taken advantage of that and appreciated it. And of course, in our further reporting, we'll make sure that we update on the exact uptake, how useful it was as a tool, and what sectors made the most use of it.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Your next question comes from Travis Danraj, Global News. Travis, please go ahead.
Hi there, Minister. Just to circle back to, I think it was Cynthia's question, how can you assure Ontarians that there aren't going to be deep cuts to social programs and significant increases in taxes ahead?
Well, what I can point to is, the largest, it's a interesting time for the question, and I appreciate it because I think we always have to look longer term. But right now we're looking at the largest expenditure in the province's history, over $170 billion, $174 billion. Some of that, of course, is designed, I mentioned $610 million for PPE. So obviously it would be expected and our hope that post a pandemic, that would be the kind of expenditure that we wouldn't have to make. And many of these expenditures, whether it was the subsidy from an electricity perspective, our subsidies for seniors through the doubling of the gains program, the support we provided for parents, many of these expenditures were in reaction to the pandemic. So that spending will not be permanent because it's in response to the pandemic. We've made sure that the dollars are there because we're not through this yet. And then we'll address the broader fiscal situation after, I think, as was mentioned. We had taken, I think, a province in a very difficult financial situation and put it back on a path to balance. That's something that will be a priority in the future. Governments, can't and shouldn't spend at these levels indefinitely, but right now the priority is making sure the resources are available, and that's really what today is about. Making sure Ontarians see that this government is going to make sure the resources are available to support Ontarians, support healthcare, support communities, support jobs.
I guess the question is, this is a government that campaigned on not increasing taxes. Can you say that with certainty taxes aren't going to go up for Ontarians based on the amount of debt that we're in now?
Ontarians have made clear to me, as I have had a chance to speak with many people, they've got a lot of uncertainty in their lives and they don't need to see their taxes increased. And this is a government, as you know, Travis, that believes that reducing taxes is actually important. And I think that's one of the reasons we saw record job growth, because we were clear about that trajectory. So our government's been clear about its view on taxes, but right now what we're being clear on is the need to make sure the resources are available. Support healthcare, support communities, support jobs, make sure that the resources are there, as we go, prospectively into this second wave, as we find out what the true damage is being done to the economy. We need to make sure the resources are available. But I think Ontarians can trust Doug Ford and trust his government to mind the taxpayers' dollar and to be someone who's always mindful of the fact that those are hard-earned dollars and that people shouldn't part with them easily. think that's all. Thanks very much, everybody, and I hope everybody has a wonderful week. Thank you.